I made a video talking about how people are having interest on using video games as some form of a propaganda to create empathy towards a particular race or group or ethnicities, and it's all coming from the UN of all places. I'm still asking the question of whether or not it's possible to create sympathy over certain races with video games. Because to be honest, as someone who has played lots of video games, I don't think that you can actually shape an opinion of something in real life based on a certain video game. I can't exactly talk about Romance of the Three Kingdoms just because I play Dynasty Warriors a lot. Let's specifically talk about the enemies and how pop culture depicts them. Now, in terms of my own, my people have been made enemies in Hollywood circles. The cast of The Raid are not so good mercenaries in Star Wars Episode 7. Joe Taslim played a bad guy in Fast and Furious 6 and Star Trek Beyond. Yeah, I was quite surprised he was in there. I think this is him? Can't tell. And yet, I don't really mind. There's nothing wrong with them. In fact, I'm proud that they're stepping in Hollywood at all. So I don't get it when people are saying that when Muslims are enemies on video games, that would create certain biases and prejudices. What? When Tony Jaa was a bad guy in Fast and Furious 7, and I was like, oh my god, that's so fucking cool. Not, yeah, fuck the ties, am I right? Good god, can I just ask these people? You know that Muslim terrorists exist, right? They exist here too in Indonesia. The Jakarta bombings that happened recently, the Bali bombings, which really hit close to the heart. Bali is my hometown. And to the bomber who said that I am happy that I bombed 200 plus people because I will die a martyr, go fuck yourself. Denying the existence of Muslim terrorists is a fucking insult to those that got hit by them. Making them enemies in fiction or joking about them are ways to cope with that. It's just way to ridicule them. And if you don't want to do that because you're afraid of offending them and afraid of them coming over and blowing you up, congratulations! These zealots have successfully terrorized you. You are playing on their hands. You're giving them much power over you. And you do all of that in the name of tolerance. Yeah, try to do that with people you disagree with next time. Oh wait, you're gonna resort on punching them. Oh, what's that? You're afraid that offending terrorists are also going to offend normal, regular Muslims? Well, that brings us to our today's article, which has cognitive dissonance up the ass. From Nazis to terrorists, do modern shooters games have a problem with the bad guys? Yes, they do have problems with the bad guys because the bad guys are shooting back at you. Why do you think this is an issue? Let's find out. On September 11, 2001, not long after the first plane hit the World Trade Center South Tower, I emptied the clip of an AK-47 to a narrow crack in the door in a desperate bid for survival. Out of ammo, I switched to a handgun, got off 2 shots, copped a sniper round in the face, and died as I peppered the air with explosives and waited to respond. I noticed that the other players and staff had begun to cluster around a tiny television in a corner of the cyber cafe. Yeah, and back then I played lots of Counter-Strike to cope with my family and friends who were talking about the Bali bombings non-stop, especially my mom who was working in tourism and hotels. Counter-Strike was one way for me to give a middle finger fuck you to these terrorists. There's nothing wrong with that. If you say to me that you cannot say fuck you to the terrorists because it might offend them, you are protecting the feelings of terrorists. Fuck you too then. Shooters are fun. They are kinetic and exhilarating in a way that few video games can be. There's an electric thrill that comes from using your aim and reflexes to triumph in digital playgrounds, but most of them require a steady stream of cannon fodder, and the depiction of these expendable enemies can enter some murky territory, particularly when it comes to terrorism. Okay, what murky territory are you talking about? Medal of Honor jumped from Omaha Beach on D-Day to Pearl Harbor in the invasion of Afghanistan in its eponymous 2010 reboot. Soon, military shooters outgrew real-life conflicts and began dropping players into fictional situations with fictional antagonists. A standout is Battlefield 2's Middle Eastern Coalition, an imaginary aggregation so lazy that it's not really much of a step up from calling it the League of Brown Dudes. You know, you would be the type of person accusing people of conflating brown people and jihadists. Except you're also conflating brown people and jihadists. Come at me and talk to me, okay? These people are killing people who have the same color as I am, and you know what? I am fucking cool with that. Why? Because these people are jihadists. These people are terrorists, and they can suck my dick. This is the issue that I have with ideologues. They have a collectivist and an individualist mindset only when it's convenient to them. The cognitive dissonance is sickening. When it's Muslims, they put in an individualist mindset. When it's gamers, all gamers are terrorists. Oh my god. Saying the representation of other cultures in these games left much to be desired is a bit like saying the Grand Canyon is a large hole in the ground, but still, the player was righteous. This links into a GDC conference talking about how the West fails to represent Muslims. I highly recommend you guys to read the transcript of that panel because there are lots of times in which the conversation shifts from talking about Muslims into talking about themselves. This just goes to show you that when people are arguing about representation or diversity, it always ends up being about how game industry senpai should notice me, notice me, notice me, and not actually trying to represent certain characters or beliefs or race. These people are projecting themselves into a particular race to make their arguments sound moral. In fact, an excerpt from the panel reads that every Muslim in every ethnicity in background should be portrayed. How? Even they don't have the answer to that. They're asking for something that they don't even know how to accomplish. As for the argument that Muslims need proper representation, well, from what I gather after reading through the transcript, they say that Westerners got it wrong, but they didn't really explain how or why or what certain kind of impact would it have to the society when they got it wrong. They cannot make themselves clear. They complain about certain aspects of Muslims in games, like how enemies in Call of Duty are Muslims, but that's it. They didn't explain why this is bad. They didn't really explain why this entire thing can just have a negative impact or something. They just pointed out, here, Call of Duty, they have Muslim bad guys. Terrible, terrible. You can't just point out to a problem and not explain why it's bad, other than going on tangents talking about themselves. They also talk about how video games can fuel discrimination and prejudices, but never really show examples of how it can, to highlight it or be clear about it or correlate it with the depiction of the Call of Duty Muslim bad guys. They say that diversity in video games and better narratives can fix these inherent prejudices and discrimination, but I'm not convinced. I don't know how video games are able to do that. I have a feeling that while these people have knowledge on the video games they play, they don't resonate well within the common people who do play video games. So I did my own research and asked a couple of my Indonesian friends who are gamers and also Muslims. Well, let's just say that we come into a different conclusion. The thing is, I don't even have to ask. I can literally listen to what they're discussing. And they're discussing about a CSGO and Overwatch esport competition that they're gonna make, and one guy wants to borrow my gaming mouse and mousepad. There are also discussions about what PCs to use and how many FPS that the game can get and the latencies and the pings. None of them are discussing this representation and diversity nonsense. They're having fun role-playing as terrorists and counter-terrorists. I don't know, maybe because I'm asking it in a Muslim majority region where they don't suffer as much as discrimination in the West, but you also said that it's necessary to represent as much as worldview as you can, and not just your particular circle jerks. So to the GDC panelists discussing this, you're privileged enough to afford tickets to go abroad, right? So how about you come right here and have a discussion about these things? I would love to do that. I bring in my friends here too. I'll be the translator. Anyway, let's get back to the original article.
PC gaming site Rock Paper Shotgun described how the Call of Duty series went off the rails, pointing out that while early installments consulted veterans in the horrors they endured, later games spoke to current members of the military who dealt primarily in patriotism and bravado. As a result, the games become unwitting propaganda, gung-ho demonstrations of a nation's power over the inferior upstarts. Things had changed from the miraculous successes of scrappy, ill-prepared teenage troops to giants with magic buns crushing poor brown people. By February last year, the series has sold more than 250 million copies around the world.
I love that you're constantly bashing Call of Duty throughout this entire thing, because Call of Duty single-player campaigns are notorious for being terrible. Nobody cares about these campaigns. They only care about the multiplayer, and the multiplayer have zero narrative and propaganda. Isn't that nice? Also, you're conflating brown people and terrorists again.
This clash between a game's aims and the way they are attained via gameplay is called ludonarrative dissonance. Most of the time, military shooters get around this by placing you in uniform. The body counts are still off the charts, but it doesn't matter. You're doing a bad thing to bad people to protect all that is good. There's no ludonarrative dissonance because you aren't fighting for yourself. You're fighting, more often than not, for the USA, the country which produced the bulk of these games.
Again, you're focusing too much on an aspect that pretty much everybody would agree aren't that great. Not a lot of people like the single-player campaigns of Call of Duty ever since the first Modern Warfare. People care more about the multiplayer, which again, has zero narrative elements. I'm just gonna skip the part where you trash Call of Duty and just go into the meat of your arguments.
While there's nothing wrong with enjoying a shooter, it's vital to be mindful of forced perspective and latent propaganda. There's something terribly wrong when, over the course of a franchise, someone playing a shooter goes from killing Nazis to killing various brown-skinned enemies in fictional conflicts.
Let me ask you something, and I want you to not be vague about this. Let's just say that people praise the Call of Duty single-player campaigns for being amazing and great and all of that. What do you think they would do after they play the game?
Few people that spend hours in a game killing hordes of Islamist enemies will go out and kill Muslims in real life.
Oh, you're conflating Muslims with jihadists, you fucking moron! People have no issue on killing jihadists. I think killing jihadists would make a world a better place, but apparently you have the mindset that all Muslims are jihadists. No, if we're talking about the scums of the earth that are the equivalent of Nazis today, jihadists and ISIS, they're great examples of them. Let's portray them as horrendously and badly as possible because they are bad people. But then we have people like you saying, oh, we shouldn't do that. That would hurt the feelings of Muslims. When everybody in this entire world can distinct the difference between Muslims and jihadists, the problem isn't the West. The problem isn't the games that are clearly making that distinction. The problem is you. The problem is you for interpreting this as such. The problem is you for being an overly sensitive prick, who is also a world-class moron for not being able to distinguish between both fiction and reality and actual jihadists and Muslims.
But it's much more likely that they'll take away the message, implicit in so much of digital tribalism, that these people are the enemy. They are different to me, and less than me, they are expendable.
Nobody thinks that. Nobody. You're the only person who thinks that. You're so brain dead and detached, you cannot comprehend what other people think or what other people's mindsets are. You clearly do not understand how people's minds work. You need to play some video games.
While it's problematic that terrorists become shorthand for bad guy in military shooters, it's remarkable how many
Stop. It's problematic that terrorists become shorthand for bad guys. Are you saying that terrorists shouldn't be bad guys? Are you saying that terrorists shouldn't be bad guys because it offends you? What are you even talking about at this point? What?
While it's problematic that terrorists become shorthand for bad guy in military shooters, it's remarkable how many other video games cheerfully cast the player into these roles and have them engage in activities that look like terrorism. As New Republic points out, there are still games where you are dropped into countries, often fictional though not always, and tasked with blowing up infrastructures, killing soldiers, assassinating people, stealing things, and toppling the regime.
Oh, now I see. I think the word you're looking for right there, writer, is not terrorist, but rebels. If you're telling me that video games put rebels as the bad guys, what kind of planet have you been living in? There are tons of games which are part of a rebellion, like Wolfenstein, Just Cause, Watch Dogs, Star Wars, Freedom Fighters. There are games in which the rebels are the bad guys, like FTL, Assassin's Creed Rogue, and even in some respects Star Wars. Rebels are not always enemies or good guys. Terrorists? Well, depends on what game you're talking about, because there are some bad guys who are actually terrorists that mislabel the good guys as the terrorists, so we don't really know.
The dichotomy is as bizarre as it is fascinating. In some games you battle bad guys or terrorists. In others, you sell panic and use deadly force to avenge loved ones or destroy corrupt governments. Enemies in these games, such as the Arkham series or Batman games or Dishonored and its sequel, don't remain static as you progress. They start to react to your actions. People in the game aren't just terrified, they're terrified of you, and it's a powerful feeling.
Just want to point out that Dishonored is a terrible example of this because the low chaos option in Dishonored puts some of the targets into fates that are probably worse than death. Dishonored does morality in a very black and white sense, which is contradictory to the themes and the actual story of the game, and getting the good ending for the game requires you to be stealthy and non-lethal. The premise of Dishonored is that you can be whatever you want to be, and yet it punishes you for being someone who the game gives an option to. And yes, it is a powerful feeling indeed. It's called video games. You can be anybody you want to be and not have consequences in real life. Dr. Rendermerkamp brought this point in one of his videos, and I can't help but talk about this in the latter video. It's about unwinding and how humanity absolutely needs it. And there are so many different mediums in which people unwind. We're going to talk about that later.
Sometimes I think about these things when I'm playing video games, and sometimes I think of the panic and dread caused by intolerance running rampant in the White House, and the way Australian politicians' rhetoric around immigration has metastasized into fear-mongering and xenophobia. I think about playing Counter-Strike all those years ago, and I think about how being a terrorist is sometimes simply a matter of which side you're on.
Yep, you're clearly paranoid. You're writing this article without a clear goal in mind. What are you trying to say here? The points that I gather from this article so far is people who play video games that portray brown people in a bad light could probably look at brown people as terribly as they see in the video games. As in, video games will influence your real-life perception of brown people or Muslims. Yes? Only if you're a blank slate moron who nods to everything. Yes, brown people, bad. And again, your examples are crappy single-player campaigns off of modern shooters that nobody cares about because they're really short and the stories are garbage. They only care about the multiplayer components of the game, which again, has zero narrative. You can just calm down and relax. This article is filled with paranoia about video games and the worries that video games might give the wrong perception of Muslims or brown people. Meanwhile, actual Muslim gamers are shooting the living shit out of each other in CSGO and having a good time. Which we might both agree that it is something that you desperately need to have. Before we end this video, huge thanks to Tito Dick Dickman for the pledge on Patreon. You are fantastic. That's all for the video today. If you like this, you can go ahead, click the like button, and subscribe for more. If you wish, you can support me on Patreon. And thanks for watching.